Hey, welcome back. In this video, we'll try to uncover the remaining general concepts which we mentioned in the previous video. We'll, we'll try to cover processes, activities, palettes, transitions, and shared resources in some more detail. What is a process? In integration, we try to integrate two businesses like the source and destination, for example, say A to B. So, process is something which we develop to connect the data source A and send the data to the data source, data destination B. And if business requires to do some transformations, we can do that as well in the process. So, typical business works a product is built to integrate any two entities, whether it may be business to business or application to application or anything of that sort. So, what can a process comprise? Process comprise of activities that are required to accomplish few tasks. The flow of data between these activities in a process is represented using transitions with or without conditions. And if any data transformation is required, we can use mappings. Typical Business Studio for Business Works provides a design time palettes containing activities and transitions that can be used to develop any business process. So there are a few types of processes that we use in TIPCO Business Works. What is a parent process? Basically, when we write some code, we try to uh, logically segregate the processes to make the code more readable for any developer or administrator. So so in order to create multiple processes, we have to make use of different terminologies. So the first one is parent process. Parent process can call another process or a sub process. The process that is making the call to the referred caller process is called a parent process, whereas subprocess is called by a parent process and it can also call another subprocess. The call process is referred to as subprocess or a child process. So in the runtime, we can execute these subprocesses in the same thread if we want, or we can execute the subprocess in a different thread. So inline subprocess is something which is executed in the same thread, and non-inline subprocess is something which executes in a different engine thread. What is the use case for this inline and non-inline? Just think of something like we get an employee data and we just need to insert into our backend database, and we don't need any output in return after inserting. In that case, we can just do a non-inline subprocess, and at the runtime, the main process will take the data of the employee and feed it to the subprocess, and it will create a new thread and go and insert the data of the employee into the database. Whereas if we want to fetch some employee data from a database and provide it back to the source. In this case, we need the output of the subprocess in the main process. In those scenarios, we will use inline subprocess. So we will get to know more of these use cases as we go through this course. And if it is not making any sense right now, please ignore, and we can explore it more at the later point. The next one is a component process. Like I was mentioning previously, component process is something which is responsible to react to the original event and triggers the execution of the flow. It can also be called as main process. The next one is process services. If we like if we implement any web service and we act as a server, then we call it as process service, because we provide some functionality to the client service. So when we act as a server, we call it as process services, and we can use WSDL or JSON file to implement a SOAP based web service or a REST based web service. And there is also something called process references, which is basically a client side of any web service implementation. If we wanted to invoke an external web service which is either SOAP based or REST based, then we create process references. We call it as process references. And there is one more process type called activator process, which is a special process that can be used to perform any pre-processing or post-processing tasks when the application is started or stopped respectively. Basically, this activator processor will have two operations, which is on startup and on shutdown. On startup operation is called when an application is started and but before executing any other process that is present in the application. It can be used to implement any pre-processing tasks that must be performed for an application before regular processing starts. For example, if we want to check the database, certain tables are required by the application exist or not, and create them if they do not. And we can also uh, throw the false for any unhandled exception. Then the application will not start, and we can take necessary action to successfully start the application. And on shutdown operation is something which is executed when the application is completely stopped, and it can be used to implement any post-processing tasks, like for example, send an email to administrators notifying them that the application is being stopped, and then the administrator can take necessary action if there is anything wrong with the application. So activator process can only be configured for an application module but not shared module, and there can be only one activator process per application. However, if we want to implement more complex logic inside of an activator process on startup or on shutdown, we can use more subprocesses to make the code more readable. Okay, so a simple business process can be developed by adding activities in sequence and connecting the activities using transitions with or without conditions. We are going to see in some time what transitions mean, and with or without conditions. Developing a complex business process typically involves developing a component process which is responsible for initiating the application for any external events, and one or more subprocesses. Use of subprocess makes the complex business process easier to understand and debug. Like I said, it makes the code more readable. At the runtime, the inline subprocess does not create a new job but are executed on the job created by their calling process. This is useful when we wanted to execute few tasks and we need the output from that subprocess into the main process. We execute inline subprocess. Okay, an activator process may look like this. It has on startup and on shutdown operations. If you do not have any on shutdown business logic to be implemented, we can just leave empty. And if you do not have any on startup activity and we have only on shutdown activity, then leave the on startup operation empty and implement something on shutdown. Okay, next comes the activities inside a process. We use activities. Basically, activities are the individual unit of works in a process. Activities generally interact with external system and perform a task. For example, if we wanted to interact with a database, then we can use JDBC activities. And if we wanted to interact with EMS or JMS servers or MQ servers, we can make use of JMS activities. Activities perform similar tasks, are grouped together, and that entity is called as palette. For example, JDBC, we will have JDBC query, JDBC update, and SQL Direct. So these activities can be grouped in one palette and call it as JDBC, as you see it here. And TIPCO Business Process, Business Studio for Business Works provides various technology-specific palettes using which you can develop a business process. For example, JDBC is a database. Java activities you can be used to use Java, and HTTP can be used to create HTTP based services, and FTP based we can use FTP palette activities, and file based. And if we wanted to use SFTP, we have SFTP based activities, and JMS, so on and so forth. Okay, on broader sense, we can classify the activities into regular activities which perform a specific task, which will have some input and have an output in addition to their configuration. Activities can also state the faults that can throw at runtime. This allows the process to be designed to handle these faults and perform necessary actions. And these regular activities can be further classified into synchronous and asynchronous activities. So basically, synchronous activities are blocking in nature. They block the execution of process until the activity task is completed. So, for example, if you have any JMS, synchronous activities are blocking in nature and they block the execution of the process until the activity task is completed. Whereas asynchronous activities are non-blocking in nature and they perform the task asynchronously without blocking the execution of the process. And there are process starter activities which are configured to react to the events. They trigger the execution of a process when the event occurs. And these process starter activities can only have outputs in addition to their configuration. For example, HTTP receiver process starter activity acts as a process starter when HTTP request is received. Similarly, JMS queue receiver acts as a process starter when a message is received on the queue, the process execution starts. And like I said earlier, palettes are group of activities that perform similar tasks, typically located on the right hand side of the process editor in TIPCO Business Studio for Business Works. And the palette library will have all the palettes available, and there are few palettes which will come out of the box when we install TIPCO Business Works for container edition, whereas palettes like EDI, large XML, and few other additional palettes can be installed as plugins. And the next one is transitions. Transitions can be added to activities and groups in a process. They represent the flow of execution from one activity to another. These transitions are unidirectional and cannot connect to a previously executed activity or a group in the flow. The control of the flow in a process must proceed sequentially, beginning from the starting activity or a group to the end with the last activity or a group in the process. These transitions can be categorized as without conditions, with conditions, and error transitions. So, transitions without conditions are called success transitions, and they control the flow automatically from one activity to the next one without any conditions. And transitions with conditions are also known as success with condition transitions. We can use these when an activity group completes processing and we specify some condition on the transition originating from the activity. For example, if we wanted to insert data into the database and we use JDBC update, and once the insertion is complete, we can use a success with condition transition. If the JDBC insertion is successful, then proceed to the next activity. Otherwise, there should be another transition from the same activity which is called a success no matching condition and take it to a different flow. And one more example I can think of is, for example, if we are getting some employee data and we have a backend database and we wanted to check if the employee already exists, then update his details, and if it does not exist, insert his details. So this scenario can be successfully accomplished using this success with condition and success with no matching condition transitions. Don't worry if you don't understand at this point. We can look into these in more details when we do some tutorials in Business Studio. And there is another type of transition called error transition. These are special transitions that specify the activities or groups to execute in case of an error. When configuring an activity or a group, you can select one transition to take from the specified activity or group, and the activities or groups to be executed following the error transition. Shared resources are resources that contain common configuration data that can be referenced from multiple places. You can define a shared resource and then reference it from multiple activities in same or different process. For example, you can define a JDBC connection and then use it in any of the JDBC activities in your process to connect to the database. So if you see on the left hand side, I have marked few shared resources which can be used to achieve different business use case. For example, FTP connection is used to connect to FTP servers, HTTP connector and HTTP client, JDBC connection for databases, JMS connection for JMS servers, SFTP connection for SFTP servers, SMTP resource for connecting to mail servers, TCP connection. So these are some of the shared resources which can be defined once and can be used across the application wherever you wanted to use. So we can define these shared resources in an application module as well as uh, in a shared module. If we define it in an application module, then it is not visible to the processes outside of the application module. However, if we define it in a shared module, it is visible to the process outside of the shared modules. So if you intend to use a shared connection across different multiple applications, it is ideal to use a shared module and define inside a shared module, and then can be used across uh, multiple applications. And shared variables are used to define data for the modules and jobs. There are two types of shared variables: job shared variables and module shared variables. So job shared variables are used to share the data within a job, such as between a parent process instance and a child process instance. And at runtime, the engine allocates a new variable for each job, and the value of that variable is not visible outside the job, which it was allocated. Like the scope of the job shared variable is limited to the job, whereas shared modules are used across all processes in the module and visible to all the process instances within the same module. So the key difference between a job shared variable and a module shared variable is when the job expands across module boundaries, a job shared variable is accessible outside of the module when it was set in, while the shared module variable is only visible inside the module which it was set. For references, visit docs.tipco.com. And if you want to see this content in text format, I have published this in medium.com, and I will paste the link in the comment section and pin it. Stay tuned for more